The morning after the forest chose silence felt heavier than any night filled with knocks, because quiet that follows negotiation carries uncertainty rather than peace. And as mist settled low across the clearing in Oregon, I realized that restraint does not erase consequence. It only delays it. Ethan was already awake, seated with his laptop balanced on a supply crate, reviewing a frame from the thermal anomaly near the basin where the silhouette had held just long enough to redefine scale. He had isolated the heat signature against ambient readings and adjusted contrast carefully, not to exaggerate, but to understand. Lena moved more slowly that morning, methodical but distant, cataloging audio while pausing frequently as if listening for something beyond circuitry. Elias had not come by at dawn as he had the previous day, and his absence carried a weight none of us voiced, because part of the fragile equilibrium depended on his presence, as witness and intermediary. I stepped toward the perimeter of camp and noticed immediately that the air felt different, not tense, not compressed, but unsettled, like a system recalculating after an interruption. Birds were present, yet restless, lifting and resettling repeatedly rather than maintaining steady perches. The moss beneath my boots felt damp beyond the usual moisture, as if the forest floor had absorbed more than rainfall overnight. Ethan called me over to the monitor and pointed to a segment recorded just before midnight, after we had powered down the primary cameras, but before he fully shut the secondary rig. The frame showed the outer edge of camp, empty at first glance, then a subtle shift in exposure as something passed between trunks just beyond the line of detection, not stepping into view but altering the infrared balance long enough to confirm mass. And what unsettled him most was the direction of movement, not circling camp as before, but moving parallel to it. Tracking the length of our clearing without attempting enclosure, Lena leaned closer and replayed the final seconds, noting that no knock accompanied the movement, no triangulated declaration, only silent pacing, and I felt the quiet weight of that adjustment, because silence can signal observation more intensely than warning. Daniel had written once that the most unnerving nights were those without knocks, when he sensed proximity, but heard nothing to anchor it. And as I replayed the footage, I recognized that we had crossed from negotiated distance into monitored presence. Elias arrived, mid-morning, slower than usual, and when he stepped into the clearing, his expression confirmed what the footage implied. He said the forest had not been still near his cabin, that sometime after midnight he heard a single heavy knock from deeper than usual. Not near the basin, but closer to the old logging road. The axis had shifted outward, and that shift carried implication. Ethan asked whether that meant the boundary was expanding, and Elias answered that expansion is not the right word, that when vigilance detects potential repetition, it widens its field of awareness. Lena asked whether our continued filming might be interpreted as that repetition, and Elias did not answer immediately, instead scanning the trees around camp before speaking, saying that restraint had been acknowledged. But restraint tested too frequently becomes pattern again, and pattern leads to correction. His phrasing felt less like warning and more like inevitability measured in increments. I told him about the silent pacing captured on thermal, and he nodded once, saying that once a boundary is clarified, it does not need constant announcement. Sometimes it is maintained quietly, and I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. because our decision to remain even at distance was still presence. Still pressure applied to a system already strained once before. Ethan suggested we consider ending the expedition earlier than planned, preserving equilibrium before escalation forced it. Lena agreed quietly, but I hesitated. Not from stubbornness, but from unresolved weight surrounding Daniel's final path. We had documented the basin, witnessed reconstruction, recorded triangulated assertion, and controlled withdrawal. Yet we had not fully traced the route he might have taken on the night of the gunshots. The line between Circle and Logging Road remained partially unexamined. Elias watched me as I wrestled with that thought and said that if we intended to follow that route, we needed to do so with clarity about consequence, because revisiting the old machinery site would reopen the first scar, and scars remember contact. His words settled heavily in the clearing, and for several seconds no one spoke. The forest around us layered with normal sound, yet underscored by something unspoken. The silent pacing in the footage, the shifted knock near the logging road, the widened field of awareness, all converging into a single realization. We were no longer being warned about the Circle alone. We were being reminded that the entire corridor of intrusion remained active. And as I looked toward the direction of the abandoned road where Daniel's last known coordinates intersected with machinery and gunfire, I understood that the next decision would not test reconstruction. It would test memory itself. We left camp before noon with fewer words than usual, not because there was nothing to say, but because each of us understood that the path toward the old logging road was not neutral ground. It was the corridor, where machines had once entered the forest in Oregon, and where Daniel's final coordinates intersected with noise and disruption. Elias walked slightly behind us this time, not leading, not guiding, but observing, as though allowing us to choose the angle of approach without influence. Ethan carried only one primary camera, leaving the secondary rigs powered down, and Lena kept a single recorder active at low sensitivity, the reduction in equipment intentional, almost ceremonial. The forest along this route felt different from the basin, less dense, more scarred, tree spacing uneven where heavy tires had compacted soil years ago, moss thinner where sunlight reached ground too quickly after canopy was removed. And yet beneath those scars, life had returned in layered resilience, saplings rising from ruts once carved by steel, vines reclaiming rusted metal that lay half-submerged near the edge of the path. The air here carried a faint metallic scent beneath the usual damp earth, and as we approached the bend where Daniel's map marked his final deviation from the crew, I felt the pressure of repetition press against my ribs. This was not reconstruction territory. This was origin ground, the first fracture point. Ethan paused near a cluster of rotting timbers that once supported a loading platform, and he gestured toward the soil where irregular depressions remained preserved beneath new growth. Not clear footprints, but zones where weight had shifted earth abruptly and then been covered by seasons. Lena crouched to examine a patch where moss thinned unnaturally, and beneath it, she uncovered a small fragment of faded fabric caught against a splintered beam. Not fresh, not recent, but old enough to predate our arrival. I recognized the color immediately. A muted gray that matched the jacket Daniel wore in photographs from that week. The discovery did not explode into drama. It settled heavily, confirming that this was indeed the corridor he had followed. Elias stepped forward quietly and said that the crew reported Daniel running toward the basin after the second shot, not away from it. And that detail reframed the narrative entirely, because running toward rather than fleeing implies pursuit of something specific, not panic. Ethan adjusted his camera angle to capture the platform remains and the direction of the basin beyond it, narrating softly about the spatial relationship between machinery and circle, while Lena replayed a faint segment from the night we captured silent pacing, aligning it mentally with this geography, and I felt the pieces begin to form a pattern. Daniel confronting the crew at the machinery site, hearing the first knock from the basin, moving toward it rather than away, the second shot fired not at machinery, but perhaps between two lines of presence, and then silence swallowing everything. As we stood there, the forest seemed quieter than usual, not absent of sound, but narrowed, as if filtering out extraneous noise to focus on our movement along this corridor. A faint vibration passed through the ground again, weaker than the one near the basin, yet distinct enough to register. And Lena's recorder flickered with a low pulse. Ethan glanced toward the tree line bordering the old road and whispered that the thermal readings were unstable at the far edge, not flaring like before, but shifting subtly, as though something large moved parallel beyond the visible trunks. No knock followed this time, no deliberate impact to mark distance, only the sensation of proximity adjusting to our path. Elias murmured that memory does not remain anchored to a single location. It travels the routes of disruption, and if we were retracing Daniel's steps, then vigilance would follow accordingly. I stepped closer to the platform remains and brushed aside loose bark from one of the beams, revealing another, spent casing wedged between cracks in the wood, older than the ones we found in the basin, its surface more weathered, suggesting it had fallen here before Daniel reached the circle. Ethan inhaled sharply at that detail, because it implied at least one shot had been fired near machinery before he ran deeper. And the narrative shifted again from sudden confrontation to progressive escalation. Lena whispered that if the first shot occurred here, then the corridor itself became part of the boundary, not just the basin. And as she spoke, a branch snapped somewhere beyond the tree line, not violently but with controlled pressure. The sound carried clearly through the thinning canopy. Ethan swung the camera instinctively, but did not zoom recklessly, and I felt the now familiar awareness of being tracked without enclosure. The pacing resumed quietly along the outer edge of the road, weight shifting through undergrowth in measured intervals, matching our steps, but not exceeding them. And in that mirrored motion lay the unmistakable message. We had stepped into the memory path, and memory does not remain passive when retraced. The snap of the branch did not repeat, yet the pacing beyond the tree line continued with that same deliberate restraint we had come to recognize. Not rushing, not retreating, but adjusting its distance in parallel with ours. And as we stood beside the rotting remains of the loading platform in Oregon, I felt the corridor tighten around us, without physically narrowing. Ethan kept the camera steady, resisting the urge to search wildly through foliage, while Lena angled the recorder toward the tree line where the movement registered strongest on her display. And Elias stepped closer to the beam where we found the weathered casing, kneeling carefully as though approaching a relic rather than debris. He ran his fingers just above the wood without touching it, and said that this was likely where the first shot was fired. not toward the basin, but toward the road, toward the machines, perhaps to stop them, or to create space between men and something advancing from the timber. The possibility shifted the narrative once again. Daniel may not have been reacting blindly, but attempting to halt escalation at its source. And if that was true, then the second shot near the basin had not initiated conflict but responded to it. The pacing in the trees slowed as if mirroring our stillness, and for a moment the forest felt suspended between past and present. Lena replayed the low-frequency pulse captured seconds earlier and aligned it with our current position on the map, whispering that the signal was stronger here than near the basin, as though the corridor retained imprint. Ethan glanced at me and said quietly that if we continued toward the exact coordinates of Daniel's last transmission, we would be walking directly through the line between machinery and circle. And I knew he was right. This was the path Daniel had chosen. Not away from disturbance, but through it, toward the center of conflict. Elias rose slowly from his crouch and said that retracing is not the same as repeating, but only if intention differs. His words settled into the air like a measured caution, and after a long pause I nodded and stepped forward along the old road, boots pressing into soil once compacted by heavy tires, moss thinning beneath my weight. Where the ground remembered pressure, Ethan followed with camera lowered, Lena just behind him, Elias last, and as we advanced, the pacing resumed again beyond the trees, closer now, yet still contained, weight transferring through brush without reckless noise. And I understood that whatever moved alongside us was not surprised by this route. It was familiar with it, perhaps more familiar than we were, because it had traversed this corridor in the aftermath of gunfire and engine noise 15 years earlier, halfway along the bend where the road curved toward the basin. The air shifted abruptly, cooler, denser, and a single low exhale rolled through the undergrowth to our right. Not a roar, not aggressive, but unmistakably close. Ethan stopped instantly, camera trembling slightly before steadying. Lena's recorder spiked with a waveform larger than any we had captured outside the basin. And Elias did not step back, instead raising one hand slowly in a gesture of acknowledgement rather than defense. I felt the pressure of proximity settle into my chest, not suffocating, but undeniable. And in that moment, the difference between basin and corridor crystallized. The basin was reconstruction, the corridor was memory, and we were standing within the latter, where the first fracture occurred. The pacing halted entirely, replaced by stillness so complete that even insects seemed to mute themselves. And I sensed that the next decision would define whether this remained observation or shifted toward repetition. Ethan whispered that we were within 20 yards of the last transmission coordinate, and Lena confirmed softly, her voice barely audible. And I realized that Daniel had likely stood somewhere within this invisible ring of trees when he chose to move toward the basin, perhaps hearing the same exhale, feeling the same measured proximity, and whatever decision he made then had shaped everything that followed. I took a slow breath and lowered my gaze briefly, not in surrender, but in recognition, and spoke quietly into the trees, stating that we would not fire, that no machines would follow us, that we were here to understand the path, not to alter it. The words felt fragile yet necessary, and after several seconds that stretched almost beyond endurance, the weight in the underbrush shifted, not toward us, but diagonally away, creating a gap in presence that opened like a door left ajar, rather than forced wide. The pacing resumed at greater distance, parallel but no longer pressing close, and the air eased fractionally, not relaxed, but recalibrated. Ethan exhaled audibly. Lena lowered the recorder slightly, and Elias murmured that the corridor had been acknowledged, not contested. And as we stood at the edge of Daniel's last known position, I understood that the forest was not reliving the past blindly. It was testing whether we would. And in that test lay the fragile line between remembrance and repetition. We stood there for several seconds after the weight in the underbrush shifted away, the corridor stretching before us like a line drawn between past and present. And for the first time since returning to Oregon, I felt the full gravity of Daniel's final decision settle into my body not as mystery, but as proximity. Ethan slowly lowered the camera until it rested against his chest, no longer framing the tree line, but absorbing the fact that we were standing within the last coordinates of a moment that fractured more than one life. Lena kept the recorder active, but reduced sensitivity, no longer seeking amplification, only documentation of ambient recalibration. And Elias remained still, gaze moving not with anxiety, but with long familiarity along the outer edge of the road where memory and vigilance seemed to overlap. The forest around us resumed layered sound cautiously. A distant bird call, the faint scrape of bark adjusting under its own weight. Yet beneath that surface rhythm lingered the unmistakable awareness of presence farther out, parallel to us, but no longer pressing close. And I understood then that the exhale and diagonal withdrawal had not been concession, but assessment completed. The corridor had been retraced without escalation, and that difference altered the entire arc of the story. I stepped forward one final pace to the exact point where Daniel's signal had cut off years ago and knelt, brushing aside moss and loose needles, not searching for remains or relics, but grounding myself in the physical space he once occupied. The soil here felt compacted differently than surrounding ground, as if weight had shifted abruptly and then settled. Ethan moved beside me but did not film. Lena watched silently, and Elias spoke in a low, steady voice, saying that sometimes disappearance is not eradication, but removal from repetition. That what remains is the lesson embedded in the pattern. And his phrasing carried no mysticism, only observation shaped by time. I realized that Daniel may have stepped toward the basin not to chase myth, but to interrupt escalation, to prevent machines from advancing further into reconstruction. And if that was true, then his final act had not been curiosity, but restraint. Attempted too late, the forest seemed to breathe more evenly now. No knocks, no pacing, only distance maintained with precision. And in that maintained distance, I felt the weight of choice settle fully upon me. Ethan finally spoke, voice quieter than I had ever heard it, saying that we had enough, that pushing beyond this point would not clarify the past but risk reactivating it. Lena nodded in agreement, her expression steady rather than fearful, and Elias gave a single approving glance that confirmed what the forest had already indicated. The boundary here was not to be crossed again. Not physically, not symbolically. I rose slowly and looked once more toward the tree line where the exhale had emerged, sensing that whatever moved within those layers of cedar and fir was still present, still vigilant, but no longer tightening the corridor around us. And in that measured distance lay the resolution of this chapter. Not closure, but recognition. because the forest had not responded with violence when we retraced the path. It had responded with calibrated proximity, and that calibration was the clearest message of all. As we turned back toward camp, the pacing resumed at far greater distance, barely perceptible now, more suggestion than signal. And I understood that the story of Bigfoot within these woods was not about spectacle or capture, but about boundaries negotiated across years, boundaries that remember sound and weight and repetition. And as the old logging road faded behind us beneath moss and returning life, I felt the line between intrusion and understanding settle into place. Daniel's path had been retraced without gunfire, without machinery, without forcing entry into the circle again. And that difference mattered more than any frame of thermal distortion, because escalation had not been repeated. And in a forest that corrects pattern rather than indulges it, breaking the cycle may be the only form of truth it recognizes.